Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. The Another View crew is traveling this week. Our dive into political discussions has netted the Claville Report, a Salute to Excellence nomination by the National Association of Black Journalists. As producer Lisa Godley and I traveled to the conference, we thought it the perfect time to bring you an encore edition of one of our most talked about Another View programs. Given the current climate and ongoing discussions surrounding police and communities they serve, we bring you a program we named The Talk, a police perspective. Another View is next, right after this news from NPR.
Discussing today's topics from an African-American perspective, this is Another View.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Another View. I'm Barbara Ham-Lee. In the last month, there were two fatal shootings of black men by the police, one in Louisiana and one in Minnesota. This was followed by an ambush on officers in Dallas and Baton Rouge. And then another shooting of an unarmed man laying on the ground with his hands up, all making headlines, all at least partially caught on camera. There is no question tensions abound between the community and the police, particularly when it comes to African-American males and police officers. Nationwide, we see the results: Missouri, Florida, California. Even here in Hampton Roads, there have been highly publicized confrontations, and some of them, unfortunately, come to a deadly end. African-American parents have had the talk with their sons and daughters about how to act and react when stopped by the police. And there have been several public events lately teaching young people how not to be confrontational. But what about the police side of the story? Are they overreacting because of misplaced fear? Are there racial overtones to every police stop? What are police doing to make sure their ranks represent the community? In a special encore edition of Another View, we discuss The Talk. We've gathered a panel of law enforcement executives to talk about the police and the black community. Please welcome Chief Michael Goldsmith, who heads the Norfolk Police Department. Chief Goldsmith, how are you?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
Great, thank you for being here today. Chief Kelvin Wright, in charge of leading the Chesapeake Police Officer. Chief Wright, how are you?
Oh, wonderful. Thanks for inviting me.
Great, thank you for being here. And joining us by phone is Dr. Cedric Alexander, President of the National Organization of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE. Hello, Dr. Alexander. How are you?
Good afternoon. How are you?
Good afternoon. I'm just fine. And finally joining us is Lieutenant Daniel Edwards of the Durham, North Carolina Police Department. Lieutenant Edwards, how are you?
I'm well. Good morning.
Good morning. So, gentlemen, we have a lot to talk about today. But, we all have heard about all the high-profile cases that come in the media, come to national news, and so forth. So from each of your perspectives, is it as bad as the media makes it seem? And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Alexander, because you have a national perspective on this.
Well, in terms of what we're seeing going on in Ferguson, and I think some of the other events that have not been very positive between communities of color and the police, yes, it is a serious issue. Mm-hmm. And I'm not in no way going to try to minimize that, but also have to put it in a perspective as well, too, that what we have in this country is a long history of discord between police and community, particularly communities of color. But we also have to note that over the last number of years, too, we've seen tremendous relationship building across this country with police and community. And we have to acknowledge that as well, because there are a lot of police departments out there that do a fantastic job in relationship building with police, where an event that something happens that creates some pause or some concern, that agency and that community are capable of sitting down and working through and resolving those issues. Mm-hmm. But we also still have in this country agencies and communities that are not meeting with each other, that are not on the same page. And when things go bad, they find themselves trying to communicate with a great deal of emotion and a lot of confusion and a lot of unanswered questions, immediate questions people may want answered that don't get answered. So it creates this hostility and I think that's a lot of what you see in Ferguson and in and around the St. Louis area, is that their relationships clearly have been very strained for a long period of time, which has kind of set up this dynamic of discontent. And police agencies around that community, I'm quite sure that's got to be emotionally and psychologically
draining,
worn out as well.
Exactly.
Too,
and, you know,
I want very angry.
I want to get more into the discussion about how the officers are feeling, but let me get from the rest of our officers. Lieutenant Edwards, from your perspective in Durham, North Carolina, how are police relations between the black community and the police department?
Currently, from my perspective, we're doing very well. Durham historically has been on the cutting edge of being balanced when it comes to black-white issues. But what I've seen within law enforcement, we are so linked that if one officer does something in another part of the country, the way we are portrayed in the media, we all get linked. We all get that stamp. And what we do here in Durham, we try very consciously to be upfront and connect with the people on a daily basis.
And I know that you're out on the street a lot, so you get the opportunity to talk directly with people in the community. I noticed, Chief Goldsmith, you were nodding your head when Lieutenant Edwards said, you know, we all get painted with this broad brush.
Right. You know, every police department in the nation right now is taking a look at Ferguson, and I can tell you, not to speak for Kelvin next to me, but I find it hard to believe there's not a chief in the country that isn't wondering how we don't have that happen here. So we're all looking at it, and we all understand that when the media puts these pictures on the air, people see that. You know, the citizens see it, the police see it, and it tends to have an impact on the conversations that you have, and it has an impact on how people feel about the police department. It has an impact on how the officers feel. Because certainly we have officers that are out there doing the right thing, doing what they're supposed to, and, you know, it's a little frustrating for them to say, you know, these guys in Ferguson are doing one thing. I'm trying to do it right, but I'm getting lumped in with these folks. So I think there's a little bit of that perception that goes on.
Chief Wright, your officers, when something happens, they come in, what do they say to you?
Well, I think that concern is universal across law enforcement because, you know, it's amazing how we live in a world in which we're very visually stimulated. In other words, something can happen anywhere across this country involving law enforcement. And let's be honest, no one really shows the good things that we do on the media, but the things that we do that are wrong or are bad or are not appealing, they get mass distribution. And so our officers, you know, we are into the relationship building mindset. We have to have relationships with people in the community and be faithful and cognizant of the people that we serve, that, you know, we serve at their pleasure. We're here to serve them. And I think that when you see something on the order of Ferguson or some other town where a police officer does something that is, you know, tragic or just not good, I think it affects officers' morale because they know that we will probably all be lumped in together despite their best efforts to show that we're not necessarily all the same. But we, again, you know, we're trying to do the right thing day in and day out.
You know, after Ferguson, especially in the Hampton Roads area, and I'm sure across the country, there have been these seminars, forums, people are doing the talk.
Yes.
And the talk about if you're stopped by the police, here's how you should respond. This is what should happen. Chief Goldsmith, I'm going to start with you because you are not African American, and I'm curious, number one, what you think about this effort on the community's part to ease these tensions, and then number two, did you have that type of conversation with your son?
You know, first, the community has reached out. I can tell you that I have been asked to come to any number of forums to talk to folks, to answer questions, and I will go wherever that, you know, we can do something to connect. That's what we need to do. So the community is doing their part to try to reach out and get some understanding of what's going on. As far as my son goes, I've had a talk with him about being respectful to authority. You know, I come from a military household. My father was a chief petty officer in the Navy, so that just became ingrained in that. But I've not had the same talk that African American parents have with their sons, and that's a different talk.
And from your perspective, what's the difference?
Well, the difference is, based on things that have gone on in the past and the history of this country, I never had to tell my son, make sure the police officer sees your hands all the time. I never had to tell my son that before you make a move in a car, make sure you tell the police officer what you're doing. That's a different type of talk that's being had in African-American households than are being had in Caucasian households.
So, but Chief Wright, why do we have to have that conversation then? Why does the African-American person who stopped have to keep their hands on the wheel and other things that the talk teaches?
I think there are a host of reasons why, and part of it certainly is driven by movies and television, in part. But for me, when I have two sons.
And you have two sons,
I have two sons, and I can recall when they reached a certain age, particularly about age 14, I told them, I said, look, this is how I expect you to demean yourself, not just with police, but with everyone, but in particularly with police, that you are to be respectful. You do not necessarily become belligerent. If things are not going the way that you think they're not supposed to go, do not become confrontational. We can deal with these things later. But I would rather see my sons unharmed and not in custody, and we trying to work things out, rather than perhaps being injured or in custody and we're trying to work things out. And I think also, to some degree, I told them that they had the ability to de-escalate things as opposed to escalating things. And I would prefer that they take that mode than anything else, because we can always have a dialogue. Sometimes things can go too far, and discussion is not an option. With law enforcement, when the officer is there to do his job, and he or she is going to do their job, sometimes discussion is not an option.
Lieutenant Edwards, I know that you are involved with training in the Durham Police Department. So how do you train officers then? Is there a difference, I guess, in training officers who are going to spend more time in African-American communities than others, or is it all the same?
Well, the way I train, I do not necessarily train the cultural differences. If officers ask for specifics, I can express my history. But generally, when I'm teaching, I teach verbal defense and influence, which is a proven system that basically sets the standards of how we should interact with humans. And I tell guys there are 5 universal principles. The first is respect. The next 4 are conditional, and that depends on the situation. Most people like to be told why. They like to be asked rather than told. They like to be given options. And finally, people like to be given a second chance. Now, in law enforcement, if we can afford to give you the second group, we will.
Yes.
But then there are times we cannot. And dealing with the younger generation, I'm seeing most of them want to be told why all the time. And that's where the conflict can start, and our flexibility has to begin, because we need to meet them where they are before we can get them to where we need for them to be. And a lot of new officers, they don't have that patience.
And so you have to teach that patience.
Well, we strongly encourage it. And experience will be the only teacher that gets you there.
Dr. Alexander, when, most of this confrontation and the talk is centered around African-American males, what is it about the relationship between black men in particular and the police that makes it so contentious?
Well, here again, you have to put things in a historical context. And in some communities, not all, but in some communities where police departments that don't have good relationships with citizens that live in that community, regardless of who they are, not just young black boys, but also grown-up black men. You hear some of the same type of concerns from African Americans and their interaction with the police.
But Dr. Alexander, let me ask you a question.
And I think a lot of it as well too is just a lack of communication.
Yeah.
A lack of not knowing very much about about each other, which is a greater problem across the country as well, too. And you have a great deal of generational differences, because the other thing you also hear from people is particularly in the Black and African American community, they will also tell you that they don't necessarily feel a great relationship with Black officers sometimes, who have treated them.
So it's the police,
disrespectfully.
period. It's not necessarily the white officer versus the Black officer, but it is the police, period, that they're disagreeing with. But I want to ask you, you talked about that historical perspective. So young people today did not experience what people our age, I will take license that everybody was in our age in terms of the civil rights movement and so forth. But yet that same pervasive attitude remains. So is this generationally being passed down?
No, I think it has a lot to do sometimes, not all the time. It's a much more complicated subject than what we're going to be able to get to here in the next 50 minutes. But let me say this, is that in a lot of young African-American men who are in low socioeconomic communities, who have poor education opportunities or just don't take advantage of it, kids who families struggle financially, kids who decide to go off the right path and begin to do other things, oftentimes they're the ones who are more likely to have some negative intervention with the police. And we also know that we have a population of young people out there, too, who really don't have any respect for anybody, and let alone the police. But we also know we have police out there as well, too, who can be very disrespectful of folks as well, too. As a police officer, one thing that you have to have is that you always have to stay above the fray, regardless of what people do, regardless of what people say.
And that's tough to do sometimes.
We cannot allow our personal stuff to get in the way.
Yeah.
But I'm also reminded of the fact that we're human beings as well, too.
Absolutely.
And we have we have a calling where we have to conduct ourselves in a way that a lot of times, people get smart with you, say silly things, do things to throw you off as a police officer. But it's really staying focused on the things you have to stay focused on.
Okay.
But it's really very difficult. There's no simple kind of way other than what I just heard one of your other speakers say, and that is respect. Because I told a group of church folks last week that I was sitting in front of, and they asked some of the same questions you're asking now. One thing that I said to all of them is that be respectful when you're stopped by the police. Regardless of what their response is to you, you be respectful. You fight that battle later, but you're not going to win it out there on the street. So, and comply. And if the officer asks you to step outside the car, just step outside the car. If the officer asks you to show your ID, just show your ID. If an officer tells you under arrest, comply. And because you're not going to win that out there on the street, we can take that issue up later. But it has to be a sense of in ourselves where we just have to. That is the law. At the end of the day, that is the law.
Absolutely. Let me stop you for
perspective. Then we have avenues that we can.
Okay, Dr. Alexander. I wish you were sitting here in front of us, because this conversation is really getting good here. But Chief Wright, why does it always? I'm going to play devil's advocate for a minute. Why then is it always incumbent upon the person being stopped to be the respectful one? What do you, in other words, tell the community what you're telling your officers on the other side too, so that they're not being disrespectful. It feels like we're always saying, when you get stopped, you do this, you do this, you do this. I don't get the other side of it.
Well, let me just say this.
I'll come to you in a minute.
In part, officer safety also translates into encounter safety, so that people don't act furtively, in other words, act quickly, where the officer feels like perhaps their safety may be compromised. Very much as Dr. Alexander was stating, we be respectful, be calm, because the last thing you want to do is attract a crowd that could perhaps interpret certain things that are not necessarily have taken place and think things are worse than they are. And to be honest with you, I do not mind people observing the police, recording the police. I think that is a healthy thing.
So the cameras on the uniforms, you think it's a good thing?
That not only that, but even citizens who would record an officer's contact with their cell phones, because the cell phone is everywhere, and perhaps a great majority of people have cell phones that have recording capability. If they want to record that officer's encounter, I think that is a good thing. I think that our opportunities to get better come out of things such as this, like Ferguson, because it forces all of us to re-examine our practices, our relationships with the people that we serve, to make sure that we are indeed a part of the community and not apart from it.
Dr. Chief Goldsmith, I saw you nodding your head over there.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Kelvin said. It's important to understand that we train our officers, because it is a dangerous job, to get control. And, to control the encounter,
Yes.
because you can reduce your risk by being in control. And to some people, that seems like we're being rude or discourteous. And really what it is we're being authoritative, because what we want to do is reduce the risk to the officer. Now, they should be respectful at all times doing that.
Yes.
And I'm not going to tell you that I've got 700 plus angels working for me. I have a lot that work for me, but like any human organization, I've got a few that don't get it. And if we find out that they're not getting it, then we're going to take the action that we need to discipline-wise to make sure they do get it, or we separate them from the organization.
This is a special encore edition of Another View. Please hold your calls. Another View will be back in the studio live next week. We're talking about ways to mend the rift between the African-American community and the police department. Courtney joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Courtney. You're in the air.
Hi, how are you guys?
Okay, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Good.
I had a specific question for Chief Wright, and this is addressing a point that he brought up very early on in the program, but it's in relation to the culpability of the media and how the actions of a police officer in another part of the country has an effect where it paints brushstrokes across all of law enforcement.
Yes.
And I wanted to address a specific point and get his thoughts around, obviously I'm talking about the shooting in Ferguson of Mike Brown and Officer Darren Wilson. But a lot of the members of the public, as the story unfolded, saw just the significant support from the law enforcement community that was thrown behind this specific law enforcement officer. So when we see that, there is a counterpoint that needs to address that if law enforcement officers are lumping themselves into that category and, hey, we support this cop, how are we to not think what we think?
Okay, thank you, Courtney, for the call. We'll get responses from our guests. Starting with you, Chief Wright.
I can't speak to the issue about the great deal of support that was received by the officer. I will say this, that in part, perhaps what you saw was, or as a response, my response would be that for a law enforcement officer, it has to do with due process. We enforce the laws of the state that we serve in the Commonwealth, for instance, here in Virginia, and we say we take an oath to support the Constitution of the United States. In that Constitution, our Constitution, are due process things. Whether we think the officer is guilty or of wrongdoing or not is not the issue. It has to do, how do you get there? And we say people have rights. And I personally think that we must indeed make sure that everyone's rights are protected. And so therefore, has to be an investigation. There has to be analysis of evidence, a grand jury and so forth, and determine whether he will be indicted and and charged or what have you. I think that most police officers will say, regardless of how you feel about the shooting, there is still due process laws that must be followed.
If you're just joining us, we're talking about relationships between the police and the African-American community with Chief Michael Goldsmith, Norfolk Police Department, Chief Kelvin Wright, Chesapeake Police Department, Dr. Cedric Alexander, President of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE, and Lieutenant Daniel Edwards with the Durham, North Carolina Police Department. Let me ask you, Lieutenant Edwards, we talk about the blue wall and the perception the community has that, when something happens to a police officer, officers are going to rally around no matter what. Is that a true perception?
I think it's a human response because we are human, and it's important that we support each other. Without that support, critical incidents can throw any of us off. And, as a community of law enforcement officers, it's important that we do show support for each other because we are the minority when it comes to the population. And as they spoke about the due process piece, the problem I'm seeing, the public wants to know what happened, and they want to know it then. And with the media being there, they're not oftentimes understanding that there's no process that we have that we can speed through to get to the cause and the why. And they have to just wait. I mean, even we have to wait within our own investigation. And if we're involved, it's another agency, a state agency, that's doing the investigation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Chief Goldsmith, you worked in what we used to call internal affairs, now the Office of Professional
Standards.
Standards, thank you. Can the police themselves?
I think so. One of the things that gets in the way of this public perception of the police being able to police themselves is personnel files are so closely guarded in our respective cities. And, I spent a significant amount of my time as an investigator and also as the commanding officer of the Office of Professional Standards and Internal Affairs. Mm-hmm. We did a lot of investigations that ended up in significant discipline or in separating, ended up, when they were substantiated, separating the police officer from the department. As chief, I have fired more than I care to want to talk about for not upholding the values of the police department. So we do a good job of policing ourselves. But, what frustrates me is when I go to a community meeting and somebody wants to talk about an incident and I ask, did you call Office of Professional Standards? And invariably we'll get a response, well, no, I didn't. Mm-hmm. And, if you don't avail yourself of the process, then, one, we can't do appropriate investigation, but two, we end up with possibly a bad cop out there that we don't want.
So you need that information in order to be able to deal with it. Please hold your calls. This is a special Encore edition of Another View. We'll be back next week with the Another View Roundtable. Anthony joins us from Virginia Beach. Hi, Anthony.
Hi, thank you for taking my call.
Sure.
I just had a few comments. Actually, some of them have been addressed a little bit, but when police, I call it covering for each other. Because I've been arrested twice in my life, and both times in front of my house, one time just driving from work, another time just walking from the store, minding my own business. And then when I was walking, I'm trying to make this really short, but basically I was stopped. I was asked where I was coming from. When I told him what happened, he just got out and put me in cuffs, So I heard you talking earlier, just comply. But what happens when you're not given the chance to comply? And then another thing is, I just want to make the comment that, police are people too, but they have power over life and death. Now, when I was arrested, I was not able to get to my company vehicle. I lost my job. Being arrested for something I didn't do changed my life, okay? And when the other police got there, I had a friend with me, and all the police, they basically covered for him. My friend had to rewrite his statement 4 times because he said, I'm not signing that. That's not what happened.
Okay,
So,
let's let the officers respond. I don't mean to cut you off, but I want to make sure we get in as many calls as we can. Chief Goldsmith, you want to take that?
I want to jump in. I need to jump in.
Okay, go ahead, Dr. Alexander.
I'm the one that talked earlier about complying.
Mm-hmm.
It is horrific anytime anyone is arrested for anything that they did not do. That just should not happen. But there are cases upon, that we all know that where that has happened. Mm-hmm. But I still will support the idea. Whatever that officer's investigation reveal, you will not win it out on the street. So what happens if you don't comply? once they place you under arrest, you're going to be arrested. And what you don't want to do is complicate the situation anymore. Yes, we may be angry and frustrated about it, but it's not going to help us any if we get into an altercation with the police on the street. So we must comply, and then we have to fight that battle another day. But you can't do it in that moment.
In that
you
moment.
Can speak to where you were, what you did not do, and then it becomes part of that investigation with the officer. But if they decide they need to effect an arrest for whatever reason, they're the ones that's got to present reasonable cause, and they got to present probable cause. And the best thing for us to do, yes, is to comply in that regard. And let me talk a little bit about just one moment. I just need one moment to address this.
Okay.
Can police departments police themselves? Some can, and then there's some that can't. And because every police department cannot, but what makes the difference is through the community trust that the police department can police itself. And there are some communities that believe their local agency can, and there are some communities that people just truly do not believe that can happen. So that becomes incumbent upon that agency and that community. And what it generally tells me and what it tells anybody is that they don't have a good relationship together. So the three of your hosts today, three of your guests today may have great relationships, and we as leaders in our respective agencies can say, yes, community can trust us to do a fair and balanced investigation. But that is not true in every police department across this country.
Thank
because
you.
There are some agencies that are very questionable.
And, I wanted to ask you also while you're talking about that, from Noble's perspective then, are you actively, proactively rather, working to put officers into positions of authority so that can start to change, so that relationship can be healed?
Well, I don't know how much we can do single-handed as an organization, but what we do promote throughout our organization across this country, the 57 chapters that we have, we promote that people's human rights are respected. We promote the fact that people should have good quality law enforcement. We ourselves are law enforcement officials. We know the dangers of the job. We know the challenges of the job, as you just heard the Chief mention. But in addition to that, too, we want to make sure that all people, regardless of who they are, all people have an opportunity to be treated fairly and humanely, and that their departments also are reflective, not just in terms of race of that community, but in terms of the sensitivity that we all must have, because regardless of who police your community, black or white, we all need to be sensitive to the people in which we serve.
And
that is our mantra. That is our stand. And that is where we come from. We support good, strong, fair, and equitable law enforcement. But we also need from the community their support as well, too, because it is a very challenging and difficult job. And we need that community support as well.
Okay. I want to ask you, Chief Goldsmith, I was reading an article in the Washington Post, and it was an editorial, and the writers posited that African Americans are stopped more for, and I always have a problem pronouncing this word, but investigatory stops versus traffic stops. Can you, one, explain what the difference is, and two, then give me your opinion as to whether you think they are correct?
Well, an investigatory detention, that's a hard word.
It is a hard word to say.
Investigatory detention can occur for any number of reasons. It could be based on suspicious activity. It could be based on information that the officer has that they've received from a bulletin or be on the lookout for type issue. It could be based on complaints from the neighborhood. And the idea behind an investigatory detention is to simply stop, detain, and try to find out whether there's anything going on that's not supposed to happen. Now, there's supposed to be reasonable suspicion attached to that. For us to make a Terry-type stop under Terry versus Ohio, you have to reach at least reasonable suspicion to be able to do that. So that's that type of stop, as opposed to a traffic stop where I have some reason to detain you. In other words, you've run a red light, you've violated some code that gives me the ability to halt your motion and do what I need to as far as law enforcement.
And if someone feels like you didn't have a real reason to stop them, again, they should deal with it after the event,
Yes.
not during the confrontation.
Absolutely.
This is a special encore edition of Another View. Please hold your calls. Another View will be back in the studio live next week. Harriet joins us from Enfield. Harriet, you're on the air.
Yes, I'd like to ask a simple question, please, of your participants there.
Uh-huh.
I'm a healthcare provider, and I know in the past, if I injure myself in a hospital, they immediately do drug testing. And I would like to know if they randomly drug test the officers, and when there's a fatality involved, if the officers are immediately drug tested, particularly if the person is unarmed, or regardless if they're unarmed or not.
Okay.
And in general, my question regards what is involved in an internal investigation specifically, and what kind of disclosure do you do to the public about that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you for your call. Who wants to start? Why don't I start with you, Chief Wright?
We do have random drug testing in our city. We also have what's known as suspicious activity in order to test someone as well. You have to articulate the reasons why you want to drug test someone. The question regarding the process of an investigation of a complaint, I suspect some of us there's some similarities in the way many agencies handle them. Mm-hmm. One of the callers earlier, Anthony, I was kind of interested in what he said when he had a friend had to
change his
statement 4 times and sign
yeah.
it. Mm-hmm. You know, for us, we do not require a citizen to sign anything. If you want to make a complaint against an officer, that's fine. If your statement is what your statement is, we don't require you to sign it. But basically, you can make a complaint on officers any way you want to, whether it's by phone, email, anonymously, what have you. And we investigate those matters thoroughly. And you have to understand also that the officer has what's known as the law enforcement procedural guarantees in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And you have to follow a certain process. And that includes the time of day or when you question them, what do you question them about, and their responses.
The point she wanted, I think also, there was how much of that can be released to the public.
And therein lies the problem, as Chief Goldsmith stated. Mm-hmm. An officer's personnel file is almost sacrosanct. And basically, the only thing that we can divulge to the citizen is that the complaint was either founded, unfounded, substantiated, or unsubstantiated. We can't discuss what discipline was meted out, if any. Here's something else that happens in the Commonwealth of Virginia. If, in fact, I am going to fire the officer for misconduct, mm-hmm. I have to give them what's known as notice of charges, or why I'm going to fire you. And for 7 days, I can't do anything to them.
Wow.
They can choose to voluntarily separate during that period of time, which is, de facto firing them. But I still can't say that I terminated that individual.
Until after 7 days after you...
I can't even tell the person who made that complaint that I terminated, that person no longer works with them. With us.
Got you. Please hold your calls. This is a special encore edition of Another View. We'll be back next week with the Another View Roundtable. Tony joins us from Virginia Beach. Tony, you're on the air.
Hello, Barbara. Thanks for taking my call.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, the reason I want to reply to the doctor when he was talking about comply. One thing that I think within the African American community is that we are not educated within our laws, within our rights. Nothing, which is kind of scary, nothing has been mentioned about the Fourth Amendment of the United States Constitution. There are, which I've heard about, probable cause, which within those categories are observational, circumstantial, and officer may use his or expertise, or even evidence that might be obtained. However, to comply, if I'm knowing my rights, and if I succumb to default on that, to let the officer do what they want to do, and then you say, well, let the officer do what he wants to do, and then go ahead and let it go within the court system, what basically is you're stating that if I know that I'm in my rights, and if I state that there is no probable cause, I still do have the right to ask the question for the to the officer. Officer, what's the probable cause? Am I detained? And if he or she doesn't have any evidence for that or any suspicion, I do have that right as an American citizen under the Fourth Amendment, which outtrumps the city and state locals. Then I don't have to comply.
Okay, let's let Dr. Alexander respond. Dr. Alexander?
Well, yeah, I want to respond, and I want to hear my other two colleagues respond, because I think we all going to say the same thing at the end. I hear what you're saying, and what you're saying is absolutely correct. But the moment that officer tells you that you're under arrest as a result of what his or her investigation may reveal, what's your option? Yeah. What is your option at that point? You can verbally stand there and articulate any parts of the law that you want. But if they say that you're under arrest based on their investigation, whatever parts they explain to you, what is your option at that point?
Okay, Chief Goldsmith. In terms of what are your options? Again, you want to encourage people to. Let me ask you this: if an officer does stop you, do they have to tell you why?
They should. They should tell you why. They should be informative of what they're doing, just in the interest of making sure that we keep good relationships with the community. But if anybody, feels like they've been stopped unjustly, there are processes in place to include civil remedies if it gets to that point. Mm-hmm. So that's, that is something that everybody needs to keep in mind when they're interacting with the police. Some of the things that also need to be talked about is the number of police interactions that actually go like they're supposed to. I know that's not
because you hear about the ones that don't happen.
We hear about the ones that don't, and I would think, mostly, out of the hundreds of thousands of stops that occur in this country, the Norfolk Police Department will go from anywhere from 230,000 to 260,000 calls for service this year by the time we end up. Most of those go just like they're supposed to, and the officers do a good job, and they, the citizens have as good an interaction as they can, depending on the circumstances. Mm-hmm. But certainly the ones that don't go right, we want to hear about as an organization, so that we can take that corrective action to get things done.
Okay, 440-2665.
But I want to go back
to
the question, because we haven't answered the gentleman's question.
Okay.
And the question was, if you, and at least this is how I'm hearing it, if you're placed under arrest and you don't believe you should be, then what's the response?
Okay, and what's the response?
If I may.
Go ahead,
Dr. Alexander's got a good point. The fact is that probable cause for an arrest oftentimes is not a high hurdle to clear. And the officer says you're under arrest and has probable cause to do so, compliance is in your best interest. Mm-hmm. To stand out there on the street and try to debate the officer about his probable causes is not going to be perhaps a favorable outcome, because the officer has then the legal authority to use appropriate force to effect the arrest.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And I don't take using force against citizens lightly. However, it is a part of what we do. And the officer is not going to be afforded opportunity when the citizen says, I'm not going unless you tell me your probable cause. Mm-hmm. The officer's not going to walk away.
So that confrontation that happens, I mean, there are both sides, two sides to the story, and what has to happen is the investigation has to come after that. Let me ask all of you a question, because we talk about the distrust of the African-American community. I know I'm painting that with a broad stroke, but how then do you find African-Americans who want to be police officers? And Chief Goldsmith, I'm going to start with you.
That is... one of the things that we are working on tremendously right now. It's one of the things that came out of Ferguson was the idea that police departments a lot of times don't represent the demographics of the communities that they're trying to police. What we've done in Norfolk is we have put together a diversity recruiting team made up of African-American officers from the rank of assistant chief all the way down to officer. And we've given them the direction to go out and go to the places that we think we can find great minority candidates to come into our department. A lot of this mistrust comes from not knowing the community not seeing people that look like them mm-hmm. when they come in. So mm-hmm. the idea is, if we can bring that perspective into the police department, bring people who are representative of that community, that will start to, I think we do a good job of building trust in Norfolk. We've done a lot of things to get into the community, and we've upped that as a result of some things that have happened. But this idea that we can bring a diverse and inclusive workforce to the community boils down to this. Police officers and police departments live and die on community support. That's it. One of the things that struck me about Ferguson is there was nobody talking for the police department, nobody. Yeah. That should never happen. In order for us to earn that trust, we've got to do all the right things. We've got to get out in the community. We've got to talk to people. We've got to give them our perspective. But the other thing we have to do is put a push on to bring, to create a diverse and inclusive workforce, to show that all people are welcome in this department. And the thing that will do for us as a department, when you get all those different perspectives in, you lose your blind spots as far as making decisions. I use my mom as an example. She grew up in the Philippines during World War II. Mm-hmm. Her father was a concentration camp survivor in Manila. She has a way that she looks at the world because of those experiences, and she can tell me about them. But you have a whole different experience. Exactly. Mm-hmm. So if you don't bring people in with those different experiences in, mm-hmm. you lose things. Mm-hmm. You lose the ability to make the best decision you can possibly can. So it's important that we bring people of all different ethnicities and experiences into our department so that we get better at what we do. I think it makes for a stronger workplace, and I think it also shows the community that we are doing our best to become part of the community. We have to be part of the community.
Lieutenant Edwards, let me ask you, I know that you go out and you speak to groups, and when you talk to children, do you hear them say, I want to be a police officer?
I don't get that often now. It depends on the age group. A lot has to do with, the things they have seen the police do. Going back to something you asked me earlier about the
Mm-hmm.
training,
Mm-hmm.
one of the things, until we can be truly reflective of our community, the things I encourage all new officers is you have to get beyond the badge. They have to know who you are. It's important for people to know Daniel, because as long as they just see the Durham police, I have that obstacle. So I stress, I get out the car, we talk to people, because when people know you, they truly do have a totally different response. There have been ambushes that that didn't happen because the bad guys saw an officer in that group that they knew. And I've been there, and it's scary, but getting out the car and letting them know that you're human at the end of the day will make a huge difference.
Okay, gentlemen, we've got less than 5 minutes left in this show, so I want to give you all an opportunity, and the lines are lit up. I am so sorry we are not going to be able to get to the rest of the calls, but send us your thoughts and comments at anotherview.org, and we'll be glad to pass them on. So, Dr. Alexander, let me start with you. Got to keep it short, but give me your recommendation to the community on ways that both sides can work to make this better.
Well, very quickly and very simply, both sides have to open up to each other. The police department, who works for the community, and our public servants, because in essence that's who we are. We work for the community. We're public servants. We're professionals, and we have a responsibility to reach out to the community and work with that community. And the community, to have an effective and strong and a good public safety, have to have the support. You have to support your local police.
Okay.
That is just...
That's imperative. That's Dr. Cedric Alexander, president of the National Association of Black Law Enforcement Executives, or NOBLE. Thank you so much, Dr. Alexander. Lieutenant Edwards, very quickly, what would you say?
I would say that we have to be forthcoming. We have to work with our media. I think if the media can be more police-friendly, if you would, instead of we get so much negative information, and the positives they don't hear. We have to balance that out. So if somehow we can get the media to report more of the good stories I think it would definitely help shape the minds of those that we interact with on a daily basis.
Okay, that's Lieutenant Daniel Edwards of the Durham, North Carolina Police Department. Thank you so much, Lieutenant Edwards. Chief Wright?
I think at the end of the day, policing at its lowest level is about human interactions. And we must all strive on both sides to meet each other in a human and a respectful manner so that we can iron out whatever issue there is, so that law enforcement can go on about its way and do its thing. I can tell you, for the most part, I dare say that very few officers are out there looking for a negative encounter with a citizen. They want the encounter to go as smoothly as possible so they can go on with their lives and want the citizens going with their lives.
Yeah, because there's danger on both sides.
Absolutely.
If there is that confrontation. That is Chief Kelvin Wright of the Chesapeake Police Department. And Chief Goldsmith, you have the last word.
I think that one of the things that's important for us to remember is if we let the extremes of any situation, of any group, grab the conversation, then we are never going to be able to get to that constructive place where we can have honest and open talks about what we need to be doing to be part of this community. And I agree with Kelvin. We have to see each other as humans and understand that all of us have a dignity afforded to us as human beings that we have a right to have. And that goes for the police and it goes for the community. We have to get past that, seeing each other in a different role and see each other as human beings on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Now, tell us more about the recruitment. What do people do if they're interested in contacting you all? What do they need to do?
They can go by our recruiting office at 2500 North Military Highway, or they can go to the city website, go to the police part, and you will see a tab there to fill out an application or get in contact with the recruiter. We are looking for people, and we are looking for African Americans and other people of color to show up to our door to build that inclusive and diverse workforce. So we want you. We want people to come in and help us make this a strong police department. So that's how they get in touch with us, is primarily through the web or through our recruiting officers. And we go to all sorts of events. We go to Norfolk State job fairs, Old Dominion job fairs. We go to the military. So if you can find one of those events, we have a schedule of them. Come talk to us.
Okay. Let me ask you, Chief Wright, are you also looking for officers?
Yes, I am.
At this point?
Always. We have an open process. You can apply online. You can call me, email me. We'll get you connected with the right people.
Okay. Gentlemen, thank you so very much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
So, callers, I'm so sorry that we didn't get a chance to get to more of you, but I hope that you will give us a call, and we will be right back.
Hello, I'm Reverend Al Sharpton, host of Politics Nation, and you're listening to Another View on WHRV 89.5 FM.
And I hope you've enjoyed this conversation today. We always try to give you another view of a situation. And so if you have comments or questions, please send them to anotherviewradio.org. Thank you for joining us for this Encore edition of Another View. Next week, we'll be back with the Another View Roundtable. Both Will and Bill were at the conventions, and we're eager to hear what they have to say. Our theme music was composed and performed by Jay Sennett. Lisa Godley is our show producer, and Victor Bowen is our audio engineer. I'm Barbara Ham Lee. Have a safe weekend, everyone, so that we can get together again next Friday at noon for Another View.